Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Nate Hastings' odyssey did not begin and end with confrontation or grief. Rather, it unfolded like a long symphony of human struggle, where every note carried the tension of his inner war and every pause carried the resonance of unsaid truths. And what made Dominic's performance so remarkable was his ability to sustain this intensity without slipping into predictability, each scene offering a fresh layer to peel back, a deeper revelation of Nate's fragile humanity and burning determination. And the more viewers watched, the clearer it became that Nate's journey was not merely about coping with loss but about rebuilding his identity in the wreckage of betrayal and sorrow, an identity threatened by Audra's duplicity, haunted by Damian's absence, and strained by the fragile threads that bound him to Lily and Devon. When Damian died, Nate's world fractured in a way that was not always loud or obvious. Dominic made the decision to portray grief as something insidious, a quiet invader that seeped into everyday life, making conversations feel heavier, silences more unbearable, and even moments of joy tinged with guilt. And this authenticity struck a nerve, for it mirrored the reality of mourning, that it rarely announces itself with grandeur but rather lingers like an ache in the bones, inescapable and enduring. And in his interactions with family, Dominic carried this ache subtly, his eyes betraying the pain his words tried to suppress, his voice breaking only in fragments as if Nate himself refused to allow his grief to consume him entirely. And the balance between fortitude and fragility gave viewers an anchor, someone to believe in not because he was flawless but because he was deeply, humanly flawed, yet resilient. His clashes with Audra became the outward manifestation of this inner turbulence. For Audra was not merely an antagonist but a living reminder of deception, a test of Nate's resolve to demand truth even when it threatened to unravel him further. And when Dominic's Nate cornered her with questions about Nice, there was a dual battle being fought, one against the lies Audra wove with calculated precision, and one against his own vulnerability, the part of him that still remembered the closeness they once shared, the lingering ghost of intimacy that made his anger burn all the more fiercely, because betrayal always cuts deepest when delivered by someone once trusted. And Dominic harnessed this contradiction beautifully, his performance capturing the flicker of hesitation before Nate pushed harder, the brief tremor of disbelief when Audra's excuses piled up, the simmering fury that erupted only in carefully chosen bursts, proving that Nate's strength lay not in explosive rage but in a calculated persistence that refused to yield. And in that refusal, Dominic presented Nate not as a man seeking vengeance but as a man fighting for clarity, for a sliver of justice in a world that felt increasingly chaotic and dishonest. But perhaps what elevated Nate's story into something richer was how Dominic wove the threads of family into every beat of his journey. Because while grief and betrayal could have easily consumed him entirely, it was the bond with Devon and Lily that both complicated and steadied his path, for theirs was not a relationship free of cracks. Old resentments, mistrust, and disagreements often reared their heads, but Dominic portrayed Nate as the one striving to navigate those cracks, refusing to let fissures widen into chasms. And this was no small task, for holding a family together while mourning is like trying to bind wounds with trembling hands. Yet Dominic's Nate rose to the challenge, his moments with Devon brimming with a delicate blend of frustration and love, his conversations with Lily layered with both support and unspoken tension. And in these dynamics, Dominic avoided one-dimensional sentimentality and instead leaned into the contradictions, allowing Nate to be both mediator and participant, both peacemaker and provocateur, both the man demanding unity and the man too wounded to always deliver it flawlessly. And this nuanced portrayal reflected the truth of family, messy, imperfect, but essential. In his quieter moments, particularly those opposite Victoria, Dominic revealed another shade of Nate, one steeped not only in grief but in memory, in the aching recognition that life could have unfolded differently, that choices made in passion or pride often carried consequences that lingered long after the moment passed. And this gave their scenes a richness that transcended the present tragedy, infusing them with a sense of history that reminded viewers how relationships evolve, fracture, and sometimes resurface in unexpected ways. And it was in these moments of hushed vulnerability that Dominic's artistry shone brightest, for he conveyed volumes without needing to speak, his posture softening, his gaze searching, his pauses weighted with a longing he could neither articulate nor dismiss. And such restraint made the scenes resonate deeply, for they felt less like scripted exchanges and more like glimpses into the raw spaces where people carry their regrets and yearnings. Nate's grief over Damian was not static either. It evolved, transformed, and sometimes collided with his pursuit of truth, creating a character arc that was not linear but jagged, unpredictable, and therefore profoundly human, and Dominic leaned into this unpredictability, never letting Nate settle into a single emotional note but instead composing him as a symphony of contradictions, strong yet broken, hopeful yet weary, loving yet distrustful. And this complexity made Nate compelling, because viewers could never fully predict how he would respond, only that whatever he did would feel deeply honest, rooted in the authenticity of lived pain and tested resilience. His reflections with Amy, where he offered her support while quietly carrying his own devastation, demonstrated the quiet strength of a man who could extend compassion even while bleeding himself, and this balance was one of Dominic's finest achievements, making Nate not a martyr, but a man who struggled yet chose to show up for others, even when it cost him. The cumulative effect of these layered portrayals was that Nate Hastings became not simply a character reacting to events but the emotional epicenter of the narrative, the lens through which grief, betrayal, and familial bonds were refracted, and Dominic, with his unflinching commitment to authenticity, transformed what could have been another tragic arc into a deeply resonant journey that pulsed with unadulterated passion and smoldering intensity, and viewers found themselves not only watching but feeling, drawn into the currents of Nate's world, compelled to walk with him through darkness and light alike. Because in his pain, his persistence, and his search for connection, there was something universal, something that reminded us all of what it means to lose, to endure, and to keep fighting for family, truth, and self, even when the odds stand mercilessly against us. Providing Nate's journey with unadulterated passion and smoldering intensity as he faced his grief, battled deception, and looked for family ties. Dominic stepped up with a number of outstanding performances, and Nate Hastings took the stage. Dominic added nuance and honesty to every scene, whether he was dealing with Audra's betrayal, grieving the loss of his brother Damian, or refocusing on situations with Lily and Devon. Nate was named Soap Hub's Performer of the Month for his ability to strike a balance between vulnerability and strength, which made him one of the month's most engaging characters. Nate and Audra's confrontation. This month, Dominic's scenes opposite Zuleika Silva's Audra included some of his best work. Nate persuaded her to tell the truth about what actually transpired in Nice after weeks of doubt. Dominic portrayed Nate's perseverance with a measured intensity, his annoyance evident in even the slightest changes in face and tone. Dominic's Nate refused to back down when Audra attempted to deflect and shift responsibility. In addition to showcasing Nate's brilliance and tenacity, his multi-layered portrayal conveyed the emotional toll of being betrayed by someone he believed he could trust. In addition, Dominic gave depth to Nate's more subdued grieving after Damian's passing. The anguish of a brother trying to strike a balance between supporting others and dealing with his own grief was depicted in his scenes. Dominic handled the burden of loss with subtle strength, whether it was through his honest assessment of Amy's difficulties or his reserved sensitivity while talking about Damian with those closest to him. He captured the many facets of sorrow, from incredulity to silent fortitude, so it wasn't simply about sadness. In his interactions with Victoria after Cole's and Damian's deaths, Dominic gave Nate a subdued intensity. His portrayal effectively conveyed the weight of loss as well as the nuanced combination of shame, devotion, and a need for connection. Their exchanges felt honest, genuine, and painfully real, recalling a time when Victoria and Nate had more in common than friendship. Every look and pause reflected a depth of feeling. Dominic's interactions with Devon and Lily were equally captivating. The three of them collaborated to paint a picture of cousins attempting to maintain order among pandemonium. Nate, played by Dominic, emerged as the reasonable compromise, seeking togetherness while also demanding the truth. Nate Hastings' journey in recent months unfolded with unadulterated passion and smoldering intensity, a tale woven with grief, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of truth, and at the very center of this intricate tapestry stood Dominic, whose outstanding portrayal elevated every beat of the storyline into something raw, palpable, and unforgettable. Dominic did not simply play Nate, he inhabited him fully, giving us a man torn between the agony of personal loss, the bitterness of deception, and the faint but vital thread of family connection that kept him anchored when the storm threatened to consume him. And in doing so, Dominic's performance resonated with a level of honesty that went beyond soap drama and struck at the universal struggle of what it means to survive devastation without losing oneself. And perhaps that is why Soap Hub rightly named him Performer of the Month, for his ability to move seamlessly between vulnerability and strength made Nate not only a compelling character but also a mirror through which viewers could see their own complicated battles with trust, love, and resilience. And nowhere was this more evident than in the emotional collision between Nate and Audra, played with icy sharpness by Zuleika Silva, whose betrayal cut through Nate with a pain more devastating than even he anticipated, because it wasn't just the lies in Nice that haunted him, it was the idea that someone he allowed close enough to see his heart could twist it into a weapon. And when Dominic's Nate confronted Audra, the screen became electric, every flicker of annoyance in his eyes, every clipped breath, every strained muscle in his jaw revealing the tightly coiled frustration of a man who refused to be gaslit, who demanded clarity when everything else in his life felt uncertain. And while Audra attempted her usual deflection, Nate's insistence pressed harder, his voice a steady storm that conveyed both anger and heartbreak. And what made Dominic's portrayal so compelling was that beneath Nate's steely persistence lived a wounded man, struggling to reconcile the intimacy they once shared with the betrayal that now defined them. So the confrontation was not only a battle for truth but also a crucible in which Nate's character was reforged, his brilliance and tenacity shining through even as the emotional toll threatened to drag him down. And in those scenes, Dominic layered Nate with shades of fire and restraint, capturing the torment of betrayal with subtle gestures, the flare of disbelief in his eyes, the pause before unleashing a hard truth, the sharp inhale of breath as if steadying himself against the tidal wave of hurt. And this skill extended into his grieving arc after Damian's passing, where Dominic turned inward, portraying not a melodramatic collapse but the slow suffocation of a man trying desperately to balance being a pillar for others with the hollow ache that gnawed at him in silence. And through this balance, viewers could see the authenticity of Nate's sorrow, for grief was not played as a singular emotion but as a constellation of conflicting states. Incredulity when first absorbing the loss, quiet strength when speaking to Amy about her struggles, and raw vulnerability when opening up in fragments to Lily or Devon. And this multifaceted approach captured the truth of mourning, that it is not only tears but also the weight of unfinished conversations, the quiet moments alone where the mind replays what will never be again. And in his interaction with Victoria following the dual tragedies of Cole and Damian, Dominic shifted Nate's energy into something subdued yet no less intense, a performance that carried the haunting complexity of shame for past mistakes, devotion toward someone he once loved, and an aching desire for connection to remind himself he was not completely alone. And in these scenes, every silence between words, every sidelong glance, every subtle lowering of his shoulders, spoke volumes, because Dominic understood that grief often renders us speechless, leaving emotion to be conveyed in the language of stillness and pause. And when paired with Amelia Heinley's Victoria, the chemistry reignited memories of a time when their bond went beyond friendship, tinged now with regret but also sincerity. And those moments became painfully real, a reminder that connection is sometimes most profound when forged in shared devastation. And while Nate's romantic and personal entanglements drew attention, it was his familial dynamics that grounded him most, particularly with Devon and Lily, as Dominic's Nate served as the reasonable compromise between fiery emotions and buried resentments. His presence like a steadying hand when chaos threatened to consume the Winters Hastings clan. And in those scenes, Dominic's ability to play mediator without diminishing Nate's personal grief showed a delicate artistry, because he was not just pacifying arguments, he was demanding accountability, urging unity without excusing deception. And this insistence on truth revealed a man unwilling to let his family fracture beyond repair, even if it meant forcing uncomfortable conversations. And thus Nate emerged not as a victim of circumstance but as a fighter, someone who could weather betrayal, shoulder loss, and still hold space for family. And this resilience, portrayed with such authenticity by Dominic, is what made Nate's journey so captivating. For his story was not only one of heartbreak but of survival, transformation, and a relentless search for meaning in the ruins of trust. And in weaving together these layers, grief-stricken brother, betrayed lover, devoted cousin, tentative confidant, Dominic ensured that every scene breathed with unadulterated passion, his smouldering intensity not a performance gimmick but an emotional truth that lingered long after the episode ended, proving that Dominic's Nate Hastings has become not only one of the month's most engaging characters but one of the show's most indispensable voices of vulnerability, strength, and defiance in the face of devastation. Nate Hastings' journey pressed forward with an almost unbearable momentum, each day stretching him between the demands of loyalty, the burdens of loss, and the sharp edges of truth he could no longer ignore. And what made Dominic's portrayal so enthralling was not simply the grief-stricken outbursts or the fiery confrontations, but the quieter moments where Nate's humanity bled through, revealing a man who wanted desperately to reconcile his fractured world yet knew that reconciliation would come at a cost. With Damian gone, a hole carved itself into Nate's life that no amount of rationality could fill, and Dominic played this void with aching restraint, never letting Nate collapse into caricatured despair but instead showing how loss creeps into every interaction, a shadow that lingers over conversations, decisions, even moments of silence. This shadow was particularly present in Nate's scenes with Devon and Lily, where the very act of sitting across the table carried unspoken weight. Memories of shared childhoods, bitter arguments over the past, and the awareness that Damian's absence had redrawn the contours of their bond. Dominic gave Nate's words a measured patience in these moments, but his eyes betrayed him, speaking of wounds still open, of trust not yet fully restored, of longing for family yet fear of rejection. The confrontation with Audra remained the most explosive outward manifestation of Nate's inner storm, for in demanding the truth from her, Nate was also demanding something from himself, the courage to face betrayal head-on instead of allowing it to corrode him quietly, and this duality gave those scenes their fiery resonance. Zuleika Silva's Audra danced with deflection, but Dominic's Nate countered with precision, his tone low yet unwavering, his body language radiating controlled fury. It was as if every ounce of grief he carried for Damian sharpened his resolve, transforming sorrow into determination. Betrayal and loss are strange bedfellows, and Dominic captured that complexity perfectly, portraying Nate as a man who could not disentangle one from the other. Damian's absence magnified Audra's duplicity, and Audra's lies deepened the weight of Damian's death. This interplay made Nate's arc uniquely compelling, for it was not grief in isolation or betrayal in isolation, but the collision of both, each feeding into the other until Nate's very identity hung in the balance. And yet, Dominic never allowed Nate to be swallowed whole by rage or sorrow. There were flickers of tenderness that reminded viewers of the man beneath the armor, particularly in his subdued yet magnetic exchanges with Victoria. These moments felt less like conversations and more like excavations, each word peeling back layers of regret, longing, and muted affection. Dominic's Nate, in those scenes, did not posture or rage. He simply existed with an honesty that made the silences almost unbearable to watch, because they felt so real, so heavy with everything left unsaid. In Victoria, Nate found someone who could understand the hollowing nature of grief, and Dominic leaned into that resonance, creating chemistry not from romantic heat but from shared devastation. Their connection became a fragile tether to something human in a world where betrayal and loss threatened to consume him. Nate's resilience was most apparent in the way Dominic led strength and fragility in the same breath. One moment, he was the unwavering cousin urging Devon to embrace unity. The next, he was the broken brother staring into space as though Damian might walk through the door at any second. This oscillation gave Nate a realism that transcended soap opera theatrics, because that is how grief works. It ambushes, it fades, it resurfaces, it never leaves entirely. And Dominic understood that truth intimately, crafting a performance that made viewers feel not as though they were watching a scripted arc but rather accompanying a man through the actual labyrinth of mourning and recovery. Family remained both Nate's anchor and his battlefield. With Lily, Dominic played the protector, the cousin who reminded her of the importance of resilience even as he was scraping together his own. With Devon, he played the negotiator, the voice that sought common ground even when old resentments simmered beneath the surface. And yet, in both relationships, Nate was also vulnerable, not immune to being hurt, not above questioning whether his efforts to hold everyone together were truly worth the toll it took on him. This duality, strength and doubt, resilience and weariness, made him not only relatable but riveting, for viewers could see themselves in his contradictions. As the weeks unfolded, Dominic turned Nate into a man who embodied the full spectrum of human response. The fire of confrontation, the ache of loss, the yearning for family, and the quiet flickers of hope that suggested he had not given up, not yet. And through it all, Dominic never once faltered in his intensity.